Hello, my name is Jupiter Hadley, and let me introduce you to the Unofficial GameMaker Meetup, a monthly meetup event where we have talks around the many aspects of game development in general, as well as with GameMaker Studio, along with casual discussions and socializing with game developers. The meetup is organized and run in our spare time by Quang DX of Asobi Tech, Juju Adams, and myself, Jupiter Hadley. More info can be found on Twitter at GMMeetup or Facebook on the Unofficial GameMaker Meetup group. Here's one of our wonderful talks. Next.
Victor Ojuel.
Yay! Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Also, thanks to this lovely gentleman here, Juju, for having me here. So I'm going to talk about my own confessions and experiences as a game writer. I am one of these weird little people, seldom seen, that actually write games. And I'm going to, start with my confession. Hi, I'm Victor. I'm a game writer. I've been writing games for a while now. And so one of my reasons for giving this particular talk and not something even weirder or even more technical is that the fact that I always have these weird conversations when I tell people I'm a game writer. So, am I a journalist? No, I'm not. I don't write about games. I write games, which is a mind-boggling concept for quite a lot of people. So am I a designer? And this is where it gets even trickier. Yes, I am a designer in a way. A narrative designer, not a pure game designer. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later on. So do I code? I do sometimes code, but it's a weird scripting language you probably wouldn't call code per se. So basically, what the hell is my job? Well, this is what I'm going to try to explain. Basically, something I tend to say is that I'm always a game writer. There's no single project I've done in which I haven't been a game writer. However, in many of them, I haven't been allowed to be a narrative designer. So those are like the two big poles and the two things that are closer to my heart, namely because I get paid for them. So, the fact that I'm able to pay rent actually depends on them. So I'm going to start very quickly discussing like very basic differences between what is proper game writing and what is narrative design. This is not meant to be very technical. This is also a kind of very contentious issue. People have like very different definitions of what narrative design is, especially because game writing is a little bit more straightforward. I'm not really big on theory, really. I'm just the guy that gets paid to do the job. So this is my really, workman's approach to that. I'm going to give you some examples from my own experience later on, and then I will end up by discussing basically how I do the job. And we will see that this changes a lot. This is a business that it's quite funky. It's on a very ad hoc basis. Every single project is quite different. And I'm basically very seldom doing the same thing twice. So basically, we'll start with what game writing is not. And this is, it might sound weird to some of you, but this is an actual question I was asked last November at Manchester Uni when I was asked to give a talk with some really nice guys who were doing an MA on screenwriting. So let's say I've written a story. I have a game here. It's like 500 pages when I print it, and this is a game. So cool. Who do I give it to? Who's going to make my game? If some of you are actually in the games industry, this probably sounds like a very funky idea. Don't actually do that, kids at home. But this is a legitimate question if you're coming from the world of cinema, where this is actually more or less how things work. You write a script, and then you basically try to sell it to somebody. I'm not sure if it's a producer or who you actually sell it to, but this is how things are done. This is not how things are done in video games, normally. So this is not something, so this is maybe my first lesson. Game writing or narrative design is not something that happens before a game. It's not something external to the development of a game. You might find examples to the contrary, but then you give your own talk. So basically, I am very fond of something Rhianna Pratchett, the writer of the Tomb Raider games, among others, said once, that games are not a writer's medium. They are even less of a writer's medium than cinema is, in terms of what comes first in a game is normally not the story, it is the mechanics and all the other stuff that go around pure design. And let me separate that from narrative design, if that makes any sense. But this is something interesting to keep in mind when you're trying to write a story for the game, when you're trying to design something narrative around the game. It is a great idea to have that from the very beginning, from as early as possible in the development process, at least in my experience, but normally they are not great as a starting point. You should start with something a little bit more mechanic-y. And it is definitely not about being an ideas guy. This is kind of a very deprecated figure. Probably all of us know some of those guys. We're not naming names. People who want to get into games development or who want to play some sort of role in games development, but it is not quite sure what they actually do. They don't code, I don't code. They don't do art, I don't do art. But they want to be involved somehow. Well, this is not what games writing or narrative design is about. It is not about being an external figure. It is not about imposing your vision upon a team. It is not about going to the development team and telling them, hey, you guys know nothing. I have this idea. You should do this shit because I'm so clever and I know how to write stories. So what is actually game writing? Well, from my point of view, and this is something I'm going to be hammering home a lot, I'm not here to teach you what game design is or how you write a game. This is more about my own experience, and I will talk about my biases and my personal experience later on so you understand where I'm coming from. So basically, my experience is somebody comes to you after a certain amount of hustling around for clients, and they tell you, hey, we want a story for our game, and normally my face is like, basically, because I'm just using stupid memes because that makes my pattern a little bit more palatable, but also because pretty much every single project is different. People come to you, they tell you they need a story, they quite often don't know what that involves. You as a professional have to quite often fly by the seat of your pants and actually make some sense of that and try to decide what the job actually implies and what you need to deliver to that client in order to fulfill their sometimes quite nebulous idea of what a story for their game means. And that brings us to narrative design, which is the fancier half-brother of game writing. So this is from Wikipedia, a really fancy, very technical website, and probably, I don't know if you can read that from the back, but basically, a narrative designer is a role in contemporary video game development, the focus of which is to design the narrative elements of a game, and to champion story within the development process. Right. So, to design the narrative elements of a game, this is a very, very nebulous, bordering on bullshit statement. Because what are the narrative elements of a game? Well, I mean, there are probably some artists here. I don't want to go into environmental design because that's totally outside of my scope. But I mean, it is really easy to argue that there's a lot of narrative and there's a lot of storytelling in the design of an environment. So if we use this particular definition, in theory, narrative designers should have a say on that. It's probably not usually the case. And about the second part, championing story within the development process, this is a very AAA thingy in terms of you have to envision this meeting room where you have a committee-style meeting, loads of them, and they need somebody who is in charge of story, somebody who is championing that, somebody who is almost lobbying for the storytelling aspects of a game. This is absolutely not my experience, but I'm not saying this is wrong. This is just how things work, because I'm mostly an indie and a freelancer, and I'll go into more detail later on. This is something that is a little bit more adequate for AAA people. Also, I mean, this whole definition, the idea itself of a narrative designer, it's quite recent. It comes from a job offer by TQH only in 2006. So this is a pretty new field. So as I said before, I'm going to start, well, I started a while ago, but I'm going to continue with my own biases, which are caveats that, in a way, they qualify everything I'm going to say. I'm a freelancer. I'm not in-house. This colors a lot of my perceptions. This is actual footage from probably Ubisoft or something. Can we erase that part? So yeah, basically my own experience of writing games and doing narrative design is basically being this slightly idealized, but kind of close to the truth. That's me circa 2040. of being this super bohemian, slightly hipstery, but totally sexy guy who spends his day in cafes writing shit and sending it to the other side of the wall, and somehow he still gets paid for that crap. But it also means, being a little bit more serious now, that you are working remotely. You are normally at least physically detached from the rest of your team. That means a lot of hours spent, invested, wasted on Skype meetings and just catching up with what everybody else is doing. Sometimes you ask a question and your client goes like, oh yeah, by the way, the art team just did like a concept of that character you described last week. So by the way, here's the concept. And you described like a very sophisticated woman who had this kind of shady thing going on because you don't know if she's going to be on your side or not. And they just basically draw this girl who looks 17 and she has blue hair. And you're like, oh, yeah, cool, yeah. Cool character concept. I'm going to see how I fit the story with that. So obviously, this is something that affects the way I see job. The other one is that I'm an indie and not a AAA developer. And obviously, this changes a lot. In more basic terms, obviously, the budgets are different. The budgets being smaller also mean that you are quite often brought into the project at a later stage because they just can't afford to have you working for them for a long time. And that means that you often have to do things in a certain way, not just to account for the fact that you have less time, but also the fact that quite often, in my experience, I keep saying my experience, but this is all my experience, I find myself working for clients who have never worked with a writer, let alone a narrative designer before. So quite often, my first task in any particular project is to actually try and suss out what they actually need, what they actually mean when they ask you that particular question we saw at the beginning. They need a story, but what does that actually mean? So let's see that with some examples. This is a game called Pharaonic. It's a game really close to my heart. It was my first commercial game. I had done some very small games before that. That was back when I still had a day job, and that was like, oh my God, my first big actual commercial project. It's basically a kind of action RPG. It was an indie take on a Dark Souls-like game. It's set in ancient Egypt. And I think this is a really good example of a 100% writing, 0% design job. So when I was brought into the project, the game was actually on a post-alpha version. It was something like 3 months from release. The game itself was finished. It was done. Nothing could be modified. And basically, the idea was, well, we have this game. It's set in ancient Egypt because the art assets are already done. Nothing can be changed there. And we need you to kind of fill in the gaps and tell a story. I'm obviously not teasing the client. This is a totally valid approach. It is a different job from pure narrative design. But it basically means that I couldn't modify anything from what was already done. I had to somehow wrap a story about that. So one of the few places I had was, well, this is basically your typical inventory screen. And they wanted a Dark Souls-like approach in that Dark Souls, or the whole saga, it doesn't have huge exposition sections. It tries to convey story through little snippets. Like, for instance, I don't know if you can read it, this little description here of this big-ass mace that this character is wielding. And it reads, "A great lord of Mycenae paid for this weapon with 20 healthy Egyptian slaves." It sounds a little bit like bullshit, and it's what we call flavor text, and it is a little bit bullshit. But still, we are giving a little bit of a side story here. We are talking about Egypt during the New Kingdom period. This is actually around the 13th century BC. One of the first things I had to do was basically read up a lot about ancient Egypt, decide on a time frame. I was not asked to do that. I was just asked to provide these little snippets and some NPC dialogues that we're going to see later on. It was on my own volition that I said, well, let's actually research this. Let's, spend a couple of weekends at the British Museum, and let's actually find a time frame that fits that, and that actually helps us tell a story of, a country invaded and, chaos and, that sort of story. I think this is just my personal approach. Again, this is the right way for me to go in terms of, instead of just like jumping straight ahead to just like writing some bullshit here, I want to have some context. So, if we are talking about the widespread invasion of the sea peoples all around the Eastern Mediterranean around the 13th century, this is something I want to know. And then I'm able to say, instead of, well, this is just some big-ass weapon from some really cool guy, this is a Lord of Mycenae in continental Greece, in the Peloponnese as well, and he paid with 20 Egyptian slaves. So because you're playing an Egyptian and you're playing in Egypt, this already tells you something about the social situation. You have foreign invaders, they're selling you people to buy these fancy weapons. So I did have no say in how this weapon actually looked, or this particular girl actually looked, but I had to find a way to accommodate the little pieces of writing I could actually do into that. So this was already done. My only inputs in here are basically this description here and the name of the weapon itself here. So that's an example. This is basically one of the screens from the very beginning. We are telling a story here. It's a little bit blah, 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 blah. I don't want to bore you with that exposition. This is probably a more interesting example. This particular boss, she was already in the story, and the art assets were already done when I arrived. Again, I could modify nothing. She was, because she's Egyptian and she's a woman, she was generically called Nefertari, whatever, sounds Egyptian. In my own retelling of the story, she's actually Queen Kirke from the Odyssey. She's coming to Egypt because there's this huge upheaval, so I'm trying to blend in the Odyssey with Egyptian story. And in my particular story, she is the leader of this cult, and they are coming to Egypt because they want some holy waters, and there's a whole thing with that. And it kind of clicks in with the fact that this whole level before and after her, the kind of enemies you find there, again, something I had no influence over, they have this vaguely Greek-looking armor. So basically, I'm trying to piece things together. So I'm trying to draw from history, and I'm probably badly torturing history into this particular thingy. But she was already in place, and I had to find something to do with that. And this is an NPC dialogue that you can barely see. This is an NPC which is, yeah, it looks like there's something weird going on. There's nothing weird actually going on. But anyway, so this character here, he's like super depressed, and you find him just before you actually go and find that final boss, and he's super depressed, and he tells you some funky story about this boss being blah, 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 blah. So this is a narrative, it's a very obvious narrative device to actually warn the player that they are going to a very tough fight, and also you are providing some context for who this person is. And in the whole, maybe 4 or 5 previous dialogues, you are warning the player that, oh, we are only here because of Queen Kirke, and I hope you don't meet her because she's like very fucking tough, and you're gonna die 1,000 times there. Yeah, she's a very tough character to kill. So this is an example of a purely, that was an example of a purely writing job. This is what I mean when I say only writing. And this is one of my current projects, probably the biggest current project I'm working on at the moment, and this is on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of having a lot of design work. So basically, this is a creature collection game. It's heavily inspired by another Japanese game, which you probably don't know, called Pokemon. And basically, you are traveling around some islands floating in the sky, and you are collecting cute little creatures called Temtem, and you basically make them fight each other. And there's a very nice and very long main quest that takes you all around the archipelago, meeting people and having a lot of fun, and fighting evil and saving the world. Never been seen before. It's still in the making. It's going to be in the making for quite a while. It's quite a successful game so far. Even before launch, it raised a little bit more than $500,000 on Kickstarter. And this is one of my biggest design jobs in terms of needing a lot of design from the get-go. So something that was quite different in this particular project, especially as compared to Pharaonic, which was my first one, is the fact that I was involved from the very beginning. I already knew the development team from Crema because we worked on another project before, and they told me, well, we're going to call you again for this project because it's something really big and it needs a lot of storytelling. So when I was brought into this project, nothing was in place. They only knew what the game was about. It's about fighting these cute creatures. It has to be family friendly. And we know that we're going to have basically 6 islands floating in the sky, and you're going to be traveling between them. So that's where before I actually started writing anything, in fact, I believe only last month I started actually writing text that is going to appear on screen when you actually play this game. And I've been working on it since last September. So it's been more than a year of creating stuff that is not actually going to be physically in the game. So what I've been doing is designing these islands, creating cultures for them, deciding, this particular island is called Omninesia. It's a work in progress. It probably won't look like that. This other one is called Deniz, which is, I'm told it means sea in Turkish. It's loosely based on Mediterranean cultures. We have another one which is like really rainy and the food is not that great, and it's called Arbory. And it's obviously based on probably not England. There's another one based on Japan. So one of the things that, so compare that to the approach we had to follow when doing Pharaonic, in which everything was made and we knew that somehow it had to be ancient Egypt, one version or another of ancient Egypt. Here, I really had the chance to do everything from the ground up and to take all those decisions in terms of, well, what sort of islands are we going to have? What is this story about? I mean, we know what the mechanics are about. The mechanics are about collecting creatures and making them fight. And we know this has to be family friendly, so how do we make that click? So basically what we are telling here is a story about, it's basically a coming of age story. You are a young Temtem tamer. It's the first time you go out of your hometown. You're meeting new people. You're discovering new cultures. This whole archipelago has been kind of isolated, with very little communication from one island to the other. That has radically changed in the last few years because you have these huge airships coming from one side to the other. So there's this general feeling of, oh my God, now we are really meeting each other. And this is something that the art team has done an amazing job, and that's something that's really coming through at least in the demo I've seen, that I can't show you, unfortunately. And we are trying to have the narrative and the art at the very least go hand in hand towards expressing that sort of thingy. So this is the exact opposite approach. We are starting from the very beginning. We are practically at the same level, the same starting point, art design, narrative design, and we're basically building it from the ground up. So to give you an example, this is my own extremely shitty drawing of my initial idea for the archipelago. As you can see, this is something that I literally just drew on a notepad while I was in a cafe, being that really intense guy from a few slides ago. I sent it to them. The art team sent this back. Like, this is more of a levels designer view of each one of the islands, which, I'm more concerned about the geographical features, about how this tells a story. So in this particular island, I have this mountain ranging here, which separates both sides of the island. So obviously what I'm trying to do is have a different culture on this side and this side of the island, and this serves a narrative purpose. On this is actually not the same one, right? No, it is, actually it is. On this other one, which is a version of this one, it's done from more of a level designer's perspective, and this is the final art that has been on the Kickstarter. So obviously, not all of my ideas made it to this part, not even mention that one. But as I said at the beginning, I am not here to dictate a vision. If you meet a narrative designer that tells you that he is actually dictating a vision, he's lying to you. This is not what the role is about. The role is about finding this sort of synergy where I create something, and then level design makes that fit within the mechanics of the game. This serves a purpose. You find some items that allow you access to some areas. That's a way of doing some gatekeeping, not allowing the player into a certain area before they do something else. And then you got the art interpretation of all that. So obviously, this has been a very different sort of job that has implied a lot of fine-tuning things, a lot of researching things before we actually get to actually write something. Whereas in Pharaonic, and I keep coming back to Pharaonic, it was about, well, we are 3 months from release, we need some fucking dialogue in place. To give you a very quick overview of other stuff, this is a VR experience, nothing to do. It's practically not a video game. This was a commission from the government of Catalonia, the region of Catalonia in Spain. It's a sort of VR time travel across Catalonia, seeing different ages and different monuments. In this particular case, this is what my deliverables look like. This is what the game looks like. This is what I actually do. It looks a little bit more like a screenplay because basically, if you don't have a lot of interaction, quite often, a VR experience feels much more, from the development point of view, like a movie. You have scenes, you have dialogues, and everything is a little bit more railroaded towards a certain thingy, and therefore the screenplay format is a little bit more adequate to that. This is a really nice game called Dimension Drive. Basically, it's a 2D shooter with spaceships and cool people and galactic empires, and it's pretty cool. In this particular game, again, the game was pretty much finished when I arrived. The storytelling side is told in this kind of comic book style scenes in between chapters. So the things I actually had to do to tell a story in this particular game were totally different from the previous one. This is actually a Twine file. Some of you might be familiar with Twine. Yeah, maybe? No? Yes. Cool, thank you. So this is actually something I'm doing for an unnamed and unnameable client. Everything is under NDA. So basically, this is a blueprint for a long-form interactive novel. So in this particular case, I'm using Twine directly. In this other case, this is an inform game that I've done on my own. This went to the interactive fiction competition. I'm quite happy. It plays quite well. It didn't make me any money directly, but it got me a lot of exposure and clients. So basically, what I'm trying to say here is, I am showing here my personal vision of how this works, and every single project is different because, as you have seen, what they actually need, the project itself, the point at which you actually enter the project, and what you need to do to provide that story and to actually fulfill that super generic question of we need a story for our game varies completely. So I'm going to finish with how I actually do that. And this is like the most gimmicky part of the whole talk. Basically, because I wasn't a freelancer before, something that I've learned to do on my own the last few years that I've been a freelancer, is basically try to divide this really funky and really heterogeneous job of being a full-time freelance narrative designer and game writer into 3 separate parts, which I call the hustle, the juggle, and the sweat. So basically, beyond the fancy names, the hustle is everything that gets you clients. The juggle is basically you're juggling those clients and making sure you can actually, deliver the job. And the sweat is, well, when you actually sit down to, write the stuff you're paid to write. So basically, the hustle, and this is something that was probably the part that's been personally more difficult for me because I was a little bit of an introvert, is getting clients. It means attending events. This is EGX Rest. It means meeting people that you have never met before. It means giving your whole sales spiel in another language. It means, giving a lot of business cards. And it's weird because the business cards I got at the very beginning, they just said writer because I thought, just putting game writer in there was a little bit more pretentious. So I got to another stage where I was able to put game writer in them. And my final stage so far is when I've just written narrative designer in there. Just like, go for it. I just give them to people, and they go like, narrative designer, what the fuck is that? And then they are in for quite a long talk. So basically, the hustle is everything that gets you clients, to simplify a lot. In this particular stage, you are your own PR salesperson. And this is something I probably have in common with every single freelancer. This particular stage is something that anyone who works in-house, as I was saying before, has probably never done before. They don't need to. They go there, they have a 9 to 5, they do their job as best as they can. I'm sure they do a great job, but they obviously never have to hunt for clients. It is debatable whether they have to juggle or not. Basically, and this sounds quite trivial, but once I kind of managed to love the hustle and more or less master it to a certain degree, you find yourself with quite a lot of clients with very different projects, as I've said before. So I have these 3, or let's say 4 clients now. One of them needs a screenplay for a VR experience. The other one needs me to basically just fill in the blanks of the dialogues of this particular game that's already finished. The other one needs me to just like think outside of the box and create a whole game from scratch and just like give them the very basics of world building. And then I have this other one which has some very funky requirements that I don't agree with, but the client says you have to do it that way. So you have to juggle that. You have to be your own producer / project manager, and this is, I don't know if you've been here, guys, but I mean, for me personally, this has been very tricky because I'm not that good at budgeting and allocating times to things. Everything takes longer than you think. One of the side effects of flying by the seat of your pants and learning on the job is that sometimes a client asks you for a budget. You budget according to the time you think this is going to take. You say this is going to take a month. It takes 3 months. Obviously, you can't tell the client that you need more money for that because it's your own fault in the first place. They didn't budget correctly. So you end up doing 3 months worth of work for the pay of 1 month. So that can get pretty tricky. And once you get over that, you actually get to do the actual writing. And honestly, sometimes it feels like a struggle just to get to that sort of point in the process when I can actually sit down and go like, right, so today I'm going to write this particular game. It feels like, wow, yes, the rest is easy shit. I'm not saying writing is easy. Writing is super tricky. But, precisely because, this probably holds for anyone doing a similar job. If you're a writer, if you want to be a writer, if you have any notion of narrative design, chances are you have already devoted thousands of your own hours to actually writing and creating stories and seeing what worked and what doesn't work. So you are probably much more experienced in this particular field or in this particular segment of the job. It's probably the other two that feel a little bit more alien to you. And that was pretty much my talk. Thank you for not snoring very loudly, those of you. I'm not looking at anyone. And that was it. Yeah.